Hello, Marcus. It's good to see you again. Glad that we have another chance to do these very interesting, enlightening, fascinating talks. My readers really like these little discussions that you and I have. So just for those of you that are new, this is Marcus Allen. 25 years he's been researching the Apollo moon missions. He's also the UK distributor for Nexus magazine. I think one of the best magazines in the world. It really is a good counter of information to the mainstream media propaganda narrative, which is now breaking down as we speak. I want to keep this part one and part two because there's a general theme in part one and part two, and that is from the launch of the Saturn V to the splashdown of the command module in the Pacific Ocean. So I want to keep that as a general theme. A third book, it's going to take me a couple of years now because I'm researching the third book right now. I don't think it'll be called part two. It'll be called something like Apollo the Deception, something like that, because there's kind of a lot of other information I want to put in there. So I have I had at least right now another 200 or 300 pages I could have added, but I decided to put that in a third book.
That's a good idea. Because at the moment we're seeing NASA's total inability to get back to the moon.
Yes, actually I've been following the group emails that we were getting, the Apollo detectives, Jarrett White and Scott Henderson, and you, of course, and
Bart and David Percy.
Yes, yeah, Bart Sabril. So I've been following that, and it is amazing to me that we're 3 years away from a supposed launch, a manned mission to the moon. And they have absolutely nothing viable, nothing to even talk about. I haven't even seen any valid basic designs of both the launch system and the lunar lander. I mean, it's incredible. When you look back, supposedly, and I'm just talking within the official narrative here, I always emphasize that because I have been sort of accused of saying, well, now you're saying it's real. Well, no, when I'm talking about it in terms of being real, I'm talking about it in terms of being real within the official narrative, NASA's official narrative. So when you talk in that context and you go back and you look at what they accomplished in, 7, 8 years, it just amazes me how people are actually anticipating a 2024 landing, given where NASA is.
NASA's got its famous rocket, hasn't it? The only thing that survived from the Constellation program, the SLS. Slow, late, and expensive. And they've just discovered that they haven't got any spacesuits yet, not that fit women, and they're trying to send women to the moon, allegedly. So they haven't got any spacesuits, they haven't got a rocket, they haven't got a lander that's even been designed, let alone built. Elon Musk is offering to do it, and he could probably succeed because he's got the right idea, and he's probably got most of the good guys from NASA already working for him on SpaceX. So NASA are really showing themselves up really quite badly. That if they could do the whole Apollo thing, as you say, 7 years from a standing start to allegedly landing on the moon, which didn't happen, but let's say that it did, in 7 years, since they tried to do it again, which is back in 2004, when President George W. Bush announced the Constellation program, and where are we now? 2021? That's 15 years. I mean, come on, guys. You're showing yourselves up. You're actually exposing the rotten heart of NASA. NASA don't build anything because they can't. They just provide the money for other people to do it. And basically Boeing, who are building a lot of the stuff, are ripping NASA off. Well, they're not ripping NASA off. They're ripping the US taxpayer off. $24 billion. Its cost to build the SLS, the Space Launch System, the slow, late, and expensive system, that hasn't even got off the ground yet, hasn't been into orbit, certainly hasn't been anywhere near the moon, and it's 15 years to do that. Well, it's a good game if you can get it, because what you've got is contractors who are invoicing NASA, or whoever it is pays the money, invoicing NASA, look, we built this bit, but it doesn't work, so we're going to do it again. Because don't forget one thing, this is usually omitted. All the money we hear about that is spent by NASA or by the US government on funding the space system, every single dollar of that pays somebody's salary. That's all it ever does. It doesn't buy bits of kit, it pays the people to make the bits of kit. That's all. All the money you hear, to $24 billion we hear, the Space Launch System has cost. Well, If you were paid $50,000 a year, it would be quite a few years for people to do it. But the money, just look at it as a term of salary. That's all it is. It's not buying any bits of kit. It's not buying wheels. It's not buying rockets. It's buying the time for people to make them. It's a good employment system. It's nice to keep people employed in activities like this. But let's not kid ourselves that it's costing money. It's paying somebody's salary, which is good. At least they're not building bombs. Well, we hope they're not.
Yeah, and a couple of things that you touched on there, and I just want to emphasize, is that when we talk about NASA building this and NASA building that, of course we're talking about not NASA building it per se, we're talking about them contracting all this work out. I mean, there was something upwards of I think there were 6 main contracting corporations, if I'm not mistaken, and something like 20,000 subcontractors. I mean, it was across the country. So we understand that. And I've been accused of, NASA didn't, you're saying NASA built this, NASA built that. No, I'm just using NASA to encompass all of it. But it's interesting what you said about salaries, because I was thinking when you were talking about that, charitable organizations, what people don't understand is that when you're making a donation, a huge percentage of that donation goes into administrative costs and salaries. And that's why you see all these scams coming out, because people don't seem to realize that they give money, and they give it because they're good souls. Yeah. I'm not condemning people for that. But boy, when you follow the money trail down the line, you find out that you'd be lucky if 5% of your money got to where it was actually for. But having said that, administrative costs are important if it's legitimate business. And as you say yourself, it's good that people are employed. I mean, keeping people employed is really good. But this is all employment based on money that's fiat money now. That's all falling apart. And it's interesting, too, that when you talk about NASA, I think NASA is slowly becoming part of the disclosure that is happening that we're seeing these days. We saw this with the UFO story that came out. That was big. People just sort of don't realize how big that story actually is. You have the U.S. military actually showing videos that they have authenticated and saying, hey, we've been monitoring this for since 1947, since the Roswell incident, and we don't know what they are. And I kind of think they have some idea, but at least that's sort of a limited hangout, if I can put it that way. I really want to get your thoughts on that.
That's a very good point. And one other thing from that, starting from the Roswell incident in July 1947, so we're talking quite a long time ago, people have been continually talking about disclosure. It's been known by different names. When it started, there were a lot of people around who were interested in what was going on, and gradually it became clear that we weren't going to be told what was going on. It was going to be necessary for people to continually pressure government, and that's what's been happening. And you mentioned the films put out by the US military. Eventually, they couldn't keep the lid on it. It had to come out. And because the pressure was kept on, there are people around, Steve Bassett on Paradigm Organization, Dr. Michael Salla on Exopolitics. These people have kept the pressure on. They've kept the pressure on for decades. And eventually the dam breaks. And I would say that there is a parallel with NASA and Apollo. We keep the pressure on. We keep talking about it. We don't let the subject die down. We don't let people distract us and sidetrack us. Eventually the truth will come out, because the truth eventually always wins. A lie can go around the world in the time it takes the truth to get his boots on, I think is the famous phrase. Yes, it's going to take time. It doesn't matter how long it takes. I probably won't be around to see it. You may not be around to see it. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, there will be a realization. That's all it is. It's a realization that what you, I, and others like us have been saying over the last 20, 30 years is true. Go back to Bill Casing in the mid-1970s. He was saying it then. And look at the ridicule that was heaped on Bill. Look at the ridicule that's been heaped on Ralph Rene after he published his book, NASA Mooned America. Look at what happened when David Percy published his book and Gerhard Wisniewski published his book, One Small Step. And eventually, it's got bigger and bigger. It's not gone away. I mean, the books, you've written 2 books now. Trevor Weaver's written 4 books. Between you, you've done nearly 2,000 pages of documentation. Well, it's not possible to do that amount of documentation. I mean, what you put in your book, if what you're saying is fabricated, you wouldn't, A, have spent the time, you wouldn't have had the references that you've found, you wouldn't have been able to do it, because it would have just seemed so stupid to go ahead and talk about something like that, because you could prove it was real. Because you can prove it's not real, and that's the key point, it's not real. Apollo was not real. Let's get real about it. It wasn't real. Sorry, a bit convoluted there. Apollo was a fraud, a fiction, a fabrication, an invention. It was a political event. It was a brilliantly executed propaganda exercise to demonstrate to the world, that's why it was on TV, because TV is very persuasive. It was live on television. We all watched it, and we all thought it was real because it was on TV. And it convinced the world that American technology was vastly superior to that of the very secretive Soviet Union. And we know what happened to the Soviet Union, so the Russian Federation is now picking up the reins. The point is that because we've continually talked about it, we've continually discussed it, we've brought things to the public attention, we've talked about it like we are talking now, people listen to it, and they think, are they complete idiots or have they got some point to make? Somebody emailed me a couple of days ago. He said, I'm on the fence about Apollo. I thought, well, that's uncomfortable, but never mind. So I gave him a bit of information, told him where to look, looked at some of the stuff I've done, some of the stuff you've done, recommended some books to read. And he came back and said, yeah, I see what you're talking about. I understand why you have doubts about the official record, which is the key point. If we have doubts about the official record, shouldn't we be allowed to say it?
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people around who will jump down our throats all the time we talk about it. I'm sure if this goes up online, there'll be various people commenting below saying, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Randy's a complete idiot. He doesn't know what he's saying. Marcus Allen, what the hell's he talking about? He doesn't know a thing. They've been saying that for years in comments under our various videos, but we're still here. We haven't gone away, and we're not going to go away, because what we're talking about can be demonstrated to be correct, can be true. Yeah, I'm sure you make mistakes, I make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes. That doesn't make us wrong, it just means that we've got to correct those mistakes, which we do. And there are certain individuals, there's no point in even naming them, because they'll only get big-headed. They've been named live on television. There are certain individuals who spend their time trying to belittle what we're saying. They don't investigate it. They won't look at it. Because if they did, they would find that their life's work, presuming that's what they do, is for nothing. What are they doing it for? They're trying to support NASA. They're basically talking amongst themselves. They agree with each other. There aren't many of them, maybe half a dozen, 8, 9, something like that. It doesn't really matter how many there are. These are people who are determined to prove themselves right. And there's one gentleman who I've been dealing with. He's written a book about how wrong we all are.
I want to just expand on something rather you said regarding the NASA proponents. I'm being very kind here. It's usually, I think it's about 9 of them. Watching them is an exercise in psychology, listening to them and what they write. I personally don't find them frustrating because I'm not taking them seriously, and I know you're not either, but it has to be pointed out what they're doing, what their tactics are. And one of the things that they tend to do a lot is they're constantly citing the official version of NASA, whatever it pertains to, whatever mission that pertains to, they're citing the official version, and they'll copy and paste the transcripts, and they'll say, he said this, he said that, this was done at a certain point on the way to the moon, this was done at a certain point on the way back. That just doesn't work for me anymore, and I know I'm going to be ridiculed for saying this, but that just doesn't work for me anymore, because those transcripts, those communication transcripts, are all part of a fictitious script. I'm convinced of that now. And that's why I go outside of that and kind of work my way in. And that's the approach I take to writing my books, is I go outside of that and I look for individuals with the proper credentials. And they don't always have to have the proper credentials, because I find now that experts can be paid off. I mean, we've seen an abundance of this, and your magazine has pointed this out many times. The official transcript, as far as I have been able to determine, is based on computer-simulated transcripts with the script and the voiceover, and with the astronauts involved, of course. I mean, this was a very meticulously done simulation. They thought of everything, or at least back then. It's amazing that they didn't anticipate technology coming in decades later that would enable the average person on a laptop computer to figure a lot of this stuff out, which is exactly what they've done. So the documents can be important to a point, but sometimes within those documents you find little nuggets and things that make you just go, wait, hold on, wait a minute, which happened with me when I was writing my first book. I was saying, well, no, that doesn't seem right. The documentary I watched about 25 years ago when Jim Lovell was talking about, the damage that happened on Apollo 13, Commander Jim Lovell, and he was talking about, when it came around the dark side of the moon and they were on their way back, and it's supposed to be 155,000 miles out that they made this burn. I don't care if it's 200,000 miles out. It's impossible to navigate the way they were doing, whether you're 50,000 miles out from Earth, 150,000 miles out, 200, hell, 340,000 miles out. If you want to factor in when you go back around the dark side of the moon, it's the method of their navigation that I have a problem with, that many people have a problem with. And I'll be ridiculed for saying that. Randy has a problem with this, but he never explains why. Of course, I did in my book, right? But when he said, keep the Earth within a grid pattern on the lunar module, when he fires the engine, he said, whatever you do, make sure you keep the Earth within a grid pattern. That was what was depicted in Ron Howard's movie Apollo 13. That's not exactly what the transcript itself says. They were using the optics, the lunar module optics, to keep the Earth within the grid pattern. But in the documentary, I remember him saying grid pattern within the lunar module window. I specifically remember him saying that, and I found that very strange. That might have been a slip-up in the documentary, or it might have been a limited hangout. Because they drop hints here and there, and I picked up a lot of that. And what I found really fascinating is the people that support the Apollo missions and the things that they write. Like, for example, I'll be reading a book on weather, space weather, from some physicist in some university, some American university, and he or she would say something like, oh, it was amazing what they accomplished in 1969 to 1972. It's just amazing, inspiring moment. And it's also amazing they had this. It's also amazing that nothing happened on the way there and back, given all the elements.
Yeah.
I remember one of these professionals actually saying, Professor, it was a miracle that nothing happened between all those missions that circumnavigated the moon and back. And she actually said that about all the elements that were involved back then. But for her to say something like that, she was actually basically, in my opinion, and I will say in my opinion, that wink, wink, if you really look at this, it's amazing that they even got out of Earth orbit, let alone to the moon and back, mad missions that is. So, little things like that, and I document that.
There's an interesting point on what people say. I was thinking, it's what people don't say. It's the things that are omitted from that official record. There's one point, I forget who made the point, but there is no discussion at all about radiation as they pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, which we all know where they are. They're 500 miles above the Earth's surface, go up for about 25,000 miles. You would think, wouldn't you, that somebody might have mentioned, how are you feeling, guys? Radiation's supposed to be building up. Are you seeing any effects? Not a single mention of radiation. And when Al Bean was being interviewed by Bart Sabrell for one of his films, Astronauts Gone Wild, he asked Al Bean, he said, did you feel anything as you go through the Van Allen belts? And you know what Al Bean said?
No, now I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt.
Yeah. Apollo 12 astronaut didn't know where the Van Allen radiation belts were, which indicated that he probably didn't go anywhere near them.
I understand that, but I think he was also in one of the Gemini missions, because that was used as an excuse to justify his comment that they didn't go out far enough to the Van Allen belts. I remember reading a comment from one of the parrots, as you call them, online, and that was a very interesting video. I watched that, Marcus. It was absolutely wonderful work there you've done, because the Gemini, of course, never went out that far. And that argument just doesn't hold water for the simple reason is, as you say, they were talking specifically within the context of the Apollo missions. What I found really funnier, though, is when he said, no, we didn't go out that far, and then when it was pointed out, well, you had to in order to get to the moon, and he says, well, there was no problem.
No problem, because if they'd gone through them and there had been a problem, he wasn't going to say it. No, it's what people don't say and what is not written. My view of the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal transcripts, and they're timed to the nearest second, these transcripts, allegedly, which implies that they are transcribed from the actual recordings that were carried out as everything was going on in real time. So they're transcribed from those recordings, and we can read them on the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. How do we know that they're real? Because they've lost the bloody tapes from which they transcribed them. So there can't be a transcription of a real live event if they can't produce the tapes to confirm what was being said. So I would claim that the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal is actually a giant film script in 7 parts, 6 landings and 1 not, maybe a bit more. Maybe Apollo 8 they practiced, Apollo 10 they practiced, Apollo 13, oh, we had a wonderful suspenseful film there, didn't we? And Ron Howard made a film with Tom Hanks of Apollo 13, and it was all wonderful, and they all got back and everybody was happy. I mean, there's so much that went wrong on that mission, Apollo 13. You'd think somebody might have pointed out the fact that, for a start, you've got an explosion, we're told, that took place halfway to the moon, 150,000 miles or wherever. It doesn't really matter where it was, the explosion happened. But an explosion on a rocket in space has one effect. It moves it. Newton's law of motion. A body will remain in motion until acted upon by another force. An explosion is another force. It would have acted on the rocket and it would have sent it off course. Assuming it was on the correct course in the first place, and assuming the whole thing was as we were told, which I doubt, the explosion would have acted on the rocket. Therefore, the rocket would have been thrown off course. How far off course? Nobody could tell you, because the Apollo guidance computer was not an autonomous computer that knew where it was, knew where it wanted to get to, and knew how to get there. It couldn't do that. It didn't have the capacity to do it. And that's some of the work you did in your first book, was looking at the Apollo guidance computer. It needed to have information and data uploaded from the mainframes at Johnson Space Center. But this couldn't happen. There wasn't time to upload it, for the craft to then change direction, and did it have enough fuel to change the direction it needed to change, and then continue to do the rest of the mission that it was designed to do, i.e. go around the back of the moon and fire its rocket to come back? And how come that the Apollo Lunar Module rocket was used to fire the craft back when it didn't carry enough fuel to do what we're told happened on Apollo 12? You need fuel to move a mass in space. Right, there won't be a resistance, an air resistance in space, so you don't need it to be aerodynamic. But you're still moving a mass, and you can calculate how much fuel is required to move a certain mass a certain distance and a certain speed. And there wasn't enough fuel. Nobody picks up on the real thing. There's people like yourself, people like Bart, people like Jarrah White, people like David Percy, who've picked up on these things, looked into it, investigated it, and come to a conclusion that there is a lot of missing information which implies that none of what we're told actually happened really happened. It couldn't have happened. The points you make about the computer, points you make about the the amount of fuel on the Apollo 13 rocket and how it was all so mysteriously wonderful that they all got back. And you'd think that contractors who were building the command module and the lunar module, which needed to have lithium dioxide crystal containers to scrub the air, scrub carbon dioxide out of the air, you'd think that their containers, the canisters, would fit the same slot in the command module and the lunar module. No, they weren't. In the command module, they were square. In the lunar module, they were circular. So they couldn't change them. But they had to interchange them. So they had this wonderful cinematic special effects, almost, showing how they managed to do it. It was relatively simple, in fact. You just put it on with gaffer tape. But the trouble is, gaffer tape doesn't work in space, we now know. So all those repairs using gaffer tape on the Apollo 15, where they broke the mudguard and replaced it with a map, with a bit of gaffer tape. No, they didn't. Gaffer tape doesn't work in a vacuum. Got you there. Come on, NASA. Come on, you parrots. Explain how gaffer tape works in space, in a vacuum. Torr 10 to the minus 12.
Yep.
That's a higher vacuum level than the Sandusky chamber, the Glenn Research Center, can produce.
You're also talking about the experiment that you were part of with Robert Williams and Scott Henderson, and I put that in the appendix of my book. I put the abridged version of it in there for readers to check out, and that was a fascinating experiment. I'd like to hear Steve Bassett's talk on that one. He's always talking about do the science, do the science. Well, you did the science.
Peter Bassett, author of the most flawed book on Apollo I've ever read.
Well, I have the honor of being mentioned in his new edition of that book. Before we get to Peter Bassett, I want to just expand on something you were saying with Apollo 13. I've read, and I wrote about this in the book in part 1, that there were 7 scenarios that possibly took place. Why did they have the accident on the way there? Did they have the accident on the way there because they had screwed up in their calculations? And, of course, they're streaming this live, this simulation live, and they realized if they had to continue on, it would have landed on the dark side of the Terminator on the lunar surface, which they couldn't do because they didn't have proper lighting for that. Several researchers have ran simulations on that, and there's a software program you can actually use to determine the actual landing and would have it landed on the sunlit side or the dark side of the Terminator. It's interesting that software program has produced different results, which is very interesting in and of itself. But there's one researcher who mentioned something I found very interesting, and his name is Andrew Johnson. I had an email exchange with him about this, and he mentioned being able to determine, at least to the best of his abilities, and that's, again, going by the official transcripts, which you cannot trust, right, from NASA, that it might have landed, if it had been real, it might have landed on the sunlit side of the Terminator. But here's the thing. It would have landed very close to the Terminator, which meant that when they were coming down or they're on their approach, the visual cues would have been far different than any previous mission or anything that they had trained for because of the sun's position coming up over the horizon, the lunar surface. So as you get closer, you have shadows that are longer because of the sun's position, which would make it very difficult for anyone, the astronauts, the piloting the lunar module, to actually navigate properly and safely. This factored into my research in Book 2 is the absolute gaps in quality control of not only many aspects of the Apollo missions, but the training aspect. So that's another thing that has now sort of muddied the waters, because when they're landing, when they be on approach, because they're doing visual landing, it's a visual approach. And I talk about this a lot in Book 2, but I won't get into that part of it. It depends on who you talk to when we're hearing different things. I'm leaning towards the theory that it was all about theatrics. It was to get people's interest back into it. You know, I talk about this too, and I know you've talked about it many times. And then, you know, you had the whole world engaged in this activity of bringing, 3 Americans back from the moon, the heroic Americans. I'm not putting America down. I love America. And American society is what we all aspire to have, the real American society.
Yeah.
Not the one that's being imposed on us right now. I'm talking about the real American society, you know, the Constitution, the way it's supposed to be, 1776 and all that. I'm all for that. But getting back to Harry Cosell coming live on TV and while he was hosting a football game, asking for the world to pray for the astronauts, and it was all factored into getting people's interest back, because by the time of Apollo 12, people's interest in the Apollo missions was waning. I want to get to Peter Bassett. That was very interesting. I know that you've had some very interesting correspondence with him, and I need to tell you, so have I. He actually came at me on my YouTube channel.
Oh, good.
I'm giving up on this challenging people to a Skype debate because I'm just, nobody wants to do it, and I'm not going to waste my time on it anymore. And you know what? I'm not interested anymore myself. But at the time, I did ask him, would you be interested in discussing this in Skype? And he said flat no, right? And this is a man, Peter Bassett, who puts his credibility on the line everywhere he goes. And instead of talking about science, he actually seems to be really obsessed with us conspiracy theorists. And he's gone after you so many times. I read some of your correspondence with him, a lot of your correspondence back to him. And I find it really interesting how you always refrain, admirably, you refrain from the personal attacks. And you're raising valid questions with him, but he comes back and he attacks you personally. And rarely gets to the valid questions. And when you actually pin him down on something, he runs off.